Imagine standing on a hill in Essex. The ground beneath your feet is wet, cold. The October fog has not lifted. Somewhere below you, 20,000 men are breathing. You can hear them, not their voices, but their weight, the creak of leather, the low animal sound of an army that has not slept. And then, from the far edge of the valley, a horn, one long note, and another army answers it, smaller, harder, moving like iron through mud. This is 1016. This is England, and it is about to cease to exist. Now listen, if you want to understand how empires fall, how dynasties burn, how a single day can erase centuries of blood and kingdom building, then you need to understand what happened at Assandun. Because this was not a raid, this was not a skirmish. This was the moment that broke Anglo-Saxon England open like a ruined shield and handed the crown of one of the most powerful kingdoms on earth to a Viking king who was barely 20 years old. Subscribe to this channel and stay with us, because the story of Cnut the Great and the Battle of Assandun is one of the most dramatic, most treacherous, most consequential stories in all of medieval history, and most people have never heard it. To understand Assandun, you have to understand what came before it. You have to feel the exhaustion in the bones of every English soldier who marched to that field. Because the year 1016 was not one battle, it was six. Six engagements in a single year against the same enemy under the same desperate sky. The Anglo-Saxons had been fighting Danish invaders for generations, not months, not years, but generations. Since the time of Alfred the Great, England had been a kingdom defined by its resistance to the Norse, and yet here they were again. Another fleet, another king, another storm from the north. Cnut the Great. Cnut, son of Sweyn Forkbeard, Prince of Denmark, had arrived in England in 1015 at the head of a massive fleet with a declaration built into the wood of every longship. He would either take the English throne or die reaching for it. His father, Sweyn Forkbeard, had actually conquered England 2 years before, forcing the old king Ethelred the Unready into exile. But Sweyn had died in 1013, just weeks after his triumph, and England had slipped back from Danish grasp like water through open fingers. Cnut was not going to allow that to happen again. And here is where the story becomes more than a military campaign. Here is where it becomes a tragedy. Because standing between Cnut and the English crown was a man who, by every account, deserved to win. Edmund Ironside, King Edmund II of England, was everything his father Ethelred was not. He was young, fierce, physically imposing, and ferociously brave. The chroniclers who recorded his deeds were not given to flattery, and yet even they could not hide their admiration. This was a man who led from the front. A man who could hold a shield wall together through sheer force of will. A man who, in that single year of 1016, had fought and won at Penselwood, at Schurston, at Brentford, at Otford. 4 battles, 4 victories. And with every victory, the hope of a free England grew stronger. Think about that. 4 battles in 1 year, each one brutal, each one hard fought. Each one demanding everything from an army that was bleeding and tired and running low on everything except stubbornness. And after Otford, after Edmund shattered the Danish lines and forced Cnut back toward his ships on the coast of Essex, it must have felt, just for a moment, like England might actually survive. But here is the thing about war. It is never just fought on the battlefield. The real battle, the one that decides kingdoms, is fought in the hearts of men who have to choose between loyalty and survival, between honor and self-interest. And at Assandun, that hidden battle would prove more decisive than any sword. The man at the center of that hidden battle was Edric Striona. His name, in Old English, carried the meaning of one who acquires, and in the politics of 11th century England, Edric had been acquiring things his entire career: land, influence, titles, survival. He was the Ealdorman of Mercia, one of the most powerful nobles in England, the kind of man who could move armies simply by choosing which side to stand on. He had served King Aethelred, betrayed him, returned to his service, betrayed him again, defected to Cnut, then, remarkably, returned to Edmund Ironside's side in 1016, claiming loyalty, swearing oaths. Edmund, desperate for reinforcements before the final campaign against Cnut, accepted him back. The chroniclers tell us that wiser men in Edmund's council warned against it. They were right to warn, and Edmund was right to be desperate. But desperation makes choices that wisdom would not. The two armies met at Assandun on the 18th of October, 1016. The location is still debated by historians. Some argue for Ashington in southern Essex, others for Ashton near Saffron Walden in the northwest of the county. The name itself, Assandun, means something close to the Hill of Ashes, which feels, in retrospect, like a prophecy no one could read in time. What is not debated is what happened there. Edmund's army was larger. Estimates place his force between 6,000 and 8,000 men, thanes and household warriors, and the feared militia of Wessex and Mercia, assembled with enormous effort after 5 campaigns of attrition. Cnut's force was smaller but harder. Danish huscarls, professional warriors of terrifying quality, men who had spent their lives in battle, who carried long axes and heavy shields, and who understood war the way a blacksmith understands fire, from the inside out. The battle began, as most shield wall battles of the period did, with the two armies advancing toward each other across open ground, formations locked, the front ranks bracing for collision. The English had the advantage of numbers. They had the morale of 4 recent victories. They had Edmund himself, visible, riding, shouting, refusing to flinch. For a time, the lines held and traded, the grinding attrition of men pressing against men, the roar and clash of iron and wood filling the valley. And then Edric Striona pulled his men out of the line. Not in retreat, not in panic, deliberately. He withdrew the Mercian contingent, a significant portion of Edmund's left or center, the accounts differ, and in doing so, he opened a gap in the English formation that the Danish warriors immediately recognized and immediately exploited. John of Worcester, writing more than a century later, recorded it plainly. Through treachery, the victory went to the Danes. Henry of Huntingdon, another 12th century chronicler, was even starker. Never was there greater treachery than at Assandun. When a shield wall breaks, it does not break slowly, it shatters. The men holding the line on either side of a gap suddenly feel the exposure on their flank, the absence of the shield that was supposed to be beside them, and something happens to an army in that moment that no amount of courage can entirely prevent. The mathematics of survival reassert themselves at the level of the individual soldier, and soldiers who were holding moments before begin to break and run. The rout at Assandun was catastrophic. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle, usually spare and controlled in its language, abandoned restraint entirely. And there, all the nobility of the English nation was there undone. Not defeated, undone. The word carries a finality, a totality, that speaks to what the chroniclers were actually witnessing. This was not a battle lost. This was a generation of Anglo-Saxon leadership destroyed in a single afternoon. Among those who fell at Assandun were men whose names defined their age. Ulf Keitel Snillinger, the great ealdorman of East Anglia, a warrior who had fought Danes before and earned a reputation fierce enough that the Danes themselves had given him a name of honor. He died at Assandun. Bishop Eadnoth, the younger of Dorchester, died there too, a churchman who had taken up arms beside his king and paid with his life. The losses extended through every rank of English nobility. Ealdormen, thanes, abbots. The men who administered England, who led its shires, who carried the institutional memory of the kingdom in their heads, they fell at Assandun, and nothing would replace them. Edmund Ironside survived. He fled west into Gloucestershire, pursued by Cnut but not caught, and there, in the wreckage of his ambitions and his army, He made the decision that no English king before him had ever made. He agreed to negotiate. The peace that followed was struck at a place called Olney, at a meeting on an island in a river, where the two kings came face to face for the first and only time. The terms divided England. Edmund took Wessex, the south, the heartland of the old Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Cnut took Mercia and the north and the Danelaw. Each recognized the other's kingship. Each agreed that when one of them died, the other would inherit the whole. It must have seemed to Edmund like a deal that could still be survived. He was young. He was healthy. He had Wessex and time and the possibility of rebuilding. He had fought Cnut to a draw in everything except the battle that mattered most. He died 40 days later. The sources are divided on whether he was murdered or whether his body simply gave out after a year of continuous warfare. He was perhaps 25 years old. He had fought 6 major battles in 12 months and had been betrayed at the moment of his greatest need. Whatever the precise cause, Edmund Ironside died on the 30th of November, 1016, and with his death, the agreement at Olney became not a division of England, but a transfer of it. Cnut, at around 20 years of age, became king of all England. Now think about what that means. A young Danish prince, the son of an invader who had seized England and then died before he could hold it, had, in the span of 2 years, completed one of the most audacious conquests in European history. Not through overwhelming numbers, not through technological superiority, but through relentless campaign pressure, professional military quality, and, crucially, the fracturing of English unity from within. Because Edric Striona did not act in isolation. He was the most visible traitor at Assandun, but the problem he represented was systemic. Anglo-Saxon England in 1016 was a kingdom that had been under siege for so long, that had seen so many kings rise and fall and compromise, that its nobility had learned to calculate survival rather than simply choose loyalty. Aethelred the Unready had spent his reign buying off Danish raiders rather than defeating them, and that policy of expedient accommodation had poisoned the political culture of England. By the time Edmund inherited the crown, he was fighting a military war with an army whose noble commanders were always calculating the odds of switching sides. Cnut understood this, and he moved quickly to eliminate the ambiguity. In the first years of his reign, he systematically removed the most dangerous elements of the English nobility. Not all of them, not brutally, but surgically and with purpose. Edric Striona, the great traitor who had delivered Assandun to the Danes, was executed in 1017. The chroniclers note that Cnut had him killed and his body thrown over the walls of London. There is a lesson in that execution. Cnut knew what kind of man Edric was. He had benefited from Edric's treachery, and he killed him anyway, because a man who betrays his own king once will betray any king given sufficient incentive. This is one of the most important things Assandun teaches us, not just about medieval England, but about the nature of political power and military loyalty in any age. The side that wins a battle is not always the side with the best soldiers. Sometimes it is the side whose enemies are most thoroughly compromised by their own internal divisions. Cnut did not defeat Edmund Ironside on that October morning. He defeated Edmund Ironside's kingdom, the idea of a unified Anglo-Saxon England, by finding the crack that Edric Striona represented and driving a wedge through it. And yet the story of Cnut the Great is not simply the story of a conqueror. Here is where history becomes genuinely remarkable. Because Cnut did not rule England the way a Viking king might have been expected to rule a conquered people. He did not reduce it to tribute-paying subjugation. He did not replace English institutions with Danish ones. He governed through existing Anglo-Saxon administrative structures, appointed English as well as Danish advisors, confirmed English laws, and, perhaps most strikingly of all, positioned himself as the legitimate continuation of the English royal tradition rather than its destroyer. He converted to Christianity, if he had not already been baptized. He made pilgrimages. He wrote letters to his English subjects with the language of pastoral care and shared responsibility. He built churches. He built, in fact, a church at Assandun itself, a stone church dedicated to St. Andrew, raised on or near the battlefield to commemorate the souls of those who had fallen on both sides, English and Danish alike. That church was consecrated in 1020 at a ceremony attended by Cnut himself, by archbishops and bishops and eldermen, a formal act of memory and reconciliation over the ground where the Old England had died. That act tells you everything about the kind of king Cnut intended to be. He was not celebrating a conquest. He was taking responsibility for it. The dead at Assandun were his subjects now, even the ones who had died fighting him, and he built them a monument that would outlast his reign by centuries. The Church of Assandun still stands on its hill in Essex today, a small stone presence on a landscape that has otherwise forgotten what happened there in the autumn of 1016. Cnut would go on to become the ruler of a North Sea empire, king of England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden simultaneously. He would be remembered by later chroniclers as one of the great kings of medieval Europe, a man who brought order and prosperity to England after decades of Danish raid and Saxon resistance. He corresponded with the Pope. He reformed the Church. He ruled with enough effectiveness that when he died in 1035, the English people mourned him. But none of that empire, none of that legacy, none of that transformation begins without Assandun. Without Edric Streona pulling his men from the line on a cold October morning and opening the gap that swallowed an entire kingdom. Drop a comment. Do you think Edmund Ironside could have beaten Cnut if Edric had stayed loyal? The real lesson of Assandun is one that military historians return to again and again, in different contexts, in different centuries, across every kind of warfare imaginable. The decisive factor in any campaign is rarely the quality of weapons or the size of armies, or even the genius of commanders. It is cohesion. The willingness of an army, at the moment of maximum pressure, to hold together rather than fracture. The Anglo-Saxons at Assandun had fought with extraordinary courage for an entire year. They had the numbers. They had a capable king. They have the moral advantage of fighting for their own land. And they lost, not because they were outfought, but because they were undermined from within by a man who valued his own survival more than the survival of his kingdom. And here is what haunts Assandun most. Edmund Ironside knew. He knew what Edric Streona was. His council had warned him, and he took the risk anyway, because he needed the men, because the alternative was facing Cnut's huscarls without the Mercian contingent, because sometimes you make the calculated gamble and the calculation proves wrong. He was not naive. He was desperate. And desperation in warfare, even the desperation of a great and brave king, creates vulnerabilities that a ruthless and patient enemy will always find. Cnut found it at Assandun on the 18th of October, 1016. The fog lifted, the horn sounded, and England changed forever. We still feel it today, not in the laws, not in the language, not in the institutions that survived and evolved through the centuries, but in something more fundamental, the understanding that no kingdom, no matter how ancient, no matter how resilient, no matter how bravely its king fights, is immune to destruction from within. That the shield wall only holds when every man beside you believes in it. That the greatest threat to any civilization is not always the enemy at the gate. Sometimes it is the ealdorman standing behind you. The Hill of Ashes, Assandun, 1016. Remember it.